The first scream never came, only silence. Then the smell hit him, the coppery tang of blood, the stench of rot, and something else, something primal, like the jungle itself had turned against him. Captain Harris McIntyre of the Australian SAS froze in the undergrowth. Somewhere ahead a movement had passed, or maybe it had been a shadow, sliding like liquid over the red soil. He swallowed hard. The trees around him were alive, whispering, breathing, watching. This was Nui Dat, 1967, and nothing here obeyed logic. Every leaf, every branch could be a trap. Every breath could betray him. "Eyes up," he whispered. 5 men in his patrol mirrored him perfectly, their movements ghost-like. Their rucksacks were filthy, uniforms shredded and stained with mud, sweat, and weeks of jungle life. They smelled worse than any enemy could imagine, but that stench was their shield. The Americans had nicknamed them jungle hobos, mocking them from afar, unaware that what they called filth was a weapon. McIntyre knelt, scanning the forest floor. Broken twigs, flattened leaves, a trail so faint it could have been imagination. His pulse spiked. Someone, or something, had passed this way, and it hadn't wanted to be seen. Hours passed. The humidity pressed against their skin like a living thing, heavy, suffocating. Every step was measured, silent, deliberate. A rookie let out a small crunch beneath his boot. McIntyre's hand shot out, gripping his shoulder. "Don't move, don't breathe, just watch." A faint whistle cut through the jungle hum. McIntyre froze. The others didn't flinch. The signal was subtle, but it was enough. Somewhere ahead someone was observing, waiting. SAS didn't hunt the jungle. They became it. At the edge of a clearing he saw it. A flicker of gray among the bamboo. 5 shapes slid from the mist, moving as one. They didn't walk. They flowed. Eyes wide, unblinking, alert. Predators in human skin. The rookie wanted to call out, to make a sound. McIntyre gripped him, cold, unyielding. "Now you see why they call us ghosts." The jungle held its breath. Birds froze mid-flight, insects stilled. Time itself seemed to pause. McIntyre understood then that what Americans brought into this forest, rifles, radios, firepower, were meaningless here. Survival demanded more than tools. It demanded becoming something else, something the jungle would accept. They moved on, deeper into the red soil labyrinth, every shadow a threat, every noise a potential ambush. Their rucksacks, soaked with sweat, mud, and the pungent smell of fermented fish, nuoc, gave them invisibility. To an untrained nose, they were just part of the earth, decay made flesh, indistinguishable from the rot and moisture of the forest floor. Then, from the corner of his eye, McIntyre saw the first evidence of the war that existed here, and nowhere else. A small clearing, littered with signs of an enemy patrol, weapons carelessly set aside, footprints half-washed by the monsoon. The Americans would have rushed in. They would have been slaughtered. The SAS waited, watching, patient. Silence was the weapon, patience the strategy, the jungle itself their ally. For McIntyre, this was the moment that would redefine war forever. This was the jungle's lesson. Technology could not compete with instinct, patience, and the willingness to become something no longer fully human. And in this quiet waiting, observing, the SAS were already predators. He let the thought settle, and then he whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "If you want to survive here, you have to become the forest." The heat pressed down like a living weight. but the men of the SAS barely felt it. Harris McIntyre moved with them, silent and alert, his senses stretching to meet the forest. The red soil clung to his boots. Every branch and leaf seemed to whisper secrets. Somewhere, unseen, the enemy watched. And yet the SAS were already several steps ahead, invisible in plain sight. Ahead, a faint movement betrayed the approach of an American patrol. McIntyre recognized the telltale signs immediately. Too clean, too bright. The unmistakable smell of civilization clinging to their clothes and skin. They laughed quietly, joking about the humidity, unaware of the predators mere meters from their line of sight. The rookie beside him swallowed hard and whispered, "Should we warn them?" McIntyre shook his head. No, let them learn. The Australians were not reckless. They were patient. A single mistake, a single sound, and the Americans would become vulnerable. The lesson the SAS wanted to teach was simple but brutal. In this jungle, appearances and instincts were everything. If a soldier smelled like home, the jungle would betray him. And the Americans, for all their technology, smelled like nothing more than soap, tobacco, and store-bought rations. The patrol paused, dropping their packs to the ground in a clearing. One of the Americans lit a cigarette, the blue smoke drifting lazily through the humid air. McIntyre's stomach twisted, not with fear, but with awe. From the foliage he watched as the SAS operators melted into the environment, their bodies almost indistinguishable from the decay and rot around them. The 5 SAS men moved as a single organism, scanning the clearing, noting every leaf bent, every insect flight disturbed. Their uniforms were rags, layered with mud, sweat, and a pungent scent of fermented fish, nuoc, that made them olfactorily invisible. Every item of equipment, every rucksack, every weapon was treated the same way. Soaked in the forest, coated in the smells and textures of the jungle itself. McIntyre remembered the warnings on base. Do not touch their packs. Now he understood. Those rucksacks were not just containers. They were extensions of the operator's camouflage, carefully maintained repositories of survival, deception, and, if needed, violence. Any intrusion could trigger a deadly trap. From his position, he watched a SAS operator crawl silently toward the American squad. The man's movements were slow, deliberate, calculated, almost ceremonial. He stopped just outside the clearing, barely breathing, barely disturbing the leaves beneath him. From where McIntyre crouched, the operator could have been mistaken for a fallen log, a patch of mud, a shadow in the dense foliage. The Americans continued their banter, unaware that the ground beneath them might already contain death. One of the SAS men tilted his head, signaling with the subtlest movement of his fingers. The others froze instantly. In the distance, a small troop of monkeys cried out, but even the jungle seemed to pause. It was as if nature itself recognized the hunters and yielded, silent, allowing them to operate. The rookie beside McIntyre shivered. How do they do that? How can they just disappear? McIntyre whispered. It's not just camouflage. It's patience, discipline, becoming the forest itself. Hours passed. The Americans moved on oblivious, leaving behind traces that the SAS had already memorized. Broken twigs, shallow footprints, a discarded cigarette butt, every detail catalogued in the minds of the operators. They would follow silently for miles if necessary, waiting for the perfect moment. They didn't hunt the enemy. They were the trap. The jungle whispered, and the operators listened. A bird took flight in the distance. McIntyre noted the angle, the height, the trajectory. A falling leaf betrayed a movement that no eye alone could detect. Every sensory input was a clue. The SAS had mastered a language older than any military manual, the language of the forest. By mid-afternoon, the Americans had reached a secondary clearing. They paused again, laughing, adjusting their gear. The SAS team remained invisible, crouched in mud and vines, indistinguishable from rot and growth. One operator leaned slightly, noting the rotation of the sun, the flow of the breeze, and the faintest vibrations in the soil. Within minutes, he knew where every American would step next, where they would place their packs, when they would shift their weight. McIntyre's heart raced. Every American movement was predictable, yet the operators made no move. There was no panic, no impatience, only observation. Every moment was a calculation, a rehearsal in silence. They had transformed perception itself into a weapon. Then the signal came. Just a barely perceptible tilt of a hand, and the SAS moved like shadows. Not rushing, not panicked, but controlled, precise, predatory. McIntyre watched as the operators approached the American squad, remaining undetected, even as the men walked mere meters from them. Their presence was only revealed when one operator brushed against the edge of a leaf, and a small, unremarkable sound caused the Americans to turn, startled, weapons raised. It was over in an instant. No shots fired, no injuries inflicted. The SAS had merely passed through, proving a point without violence. The jungle could be mastered without confrontation, and any false step could be fatal. McIntyre exhaled slowly. He had watched history in motion. These men were more than soldiers. They were predators, philosophers of the forest, silent enforcers of a brutal doctrine. The Americans would never truly understand what had just happened, and that was precisely the lesson. As the sun began to set, the SAS regrouped. Mud-streaked, sweat-drenched, and reeking of fermented fish and forest rot, they blended back into the undergrowth as if they had never existed. McIntyre felt the forest close behind them, swallowing them whole. He understood the first rule of jungle warfare here: do not underestimate the ghosts. He looked down at the young rookie beside him, eyes wide and trembling. "Remember this," McIntyre said quietly. "This is how war survives. Patience, patience, patience. The forest doesn't forgive mistakes, and neither do the hunters." For McIntyre, the lesson was already burned into his memory. In these jungles, visibility, firepower, and technology meant nothing. Only discipline, invisibility, and the ability to become one with the land could ensure survival. And somewhere, hidden, the enemy continued to move, unaware that they were already being watched, their fate quietly catalogued by predators who smelled like the forest itself. Night had fallen over the Fui province, and the jungle exhaled its thick, humid breath. Every leaf, vine, and root seemed to hum with life and death. Harris McIntyre crouched behind a moss-covered tree, the fermented stench of nuoc mom heavy on his skin. He adjusted his position silently, feeling the damp earth through his boots, listening to the chorus of the unseen. Somewhere nearby, a stream gurgled, a frog croaked, a branch snapped, all messages to a trained mind. Ahead, a small village lay half hidden in the shadows. Intelligence had reported the presence of a Viet Cong supply team, moving resources for an upcoming offensive. 5 SAS operators, led by Sergeant Kane, were tasked with a surgical strike. No noise, no warning, no casualties among civilians. The goal was pure precision. Infiltrate, gather intelligence, eliminate threats, disappear. McIntyre's heart thumped, but his breath remained steady. The rookie beside him dared not move. Kane, coated in mud, dirt, and sweat, whispered instructions so quiet they barely disturbed the night air. "Remember," he said, "we are not soldiers here. We are the jungle. Every breath, every scent, every sound belongs to the forest. The enemy only sees what we allow them to see. Do not be human." The operators moved forward, slow and deliberate, their bodies bending and twisting to match the shapes of fallen logs, puddles, and mangrove roots. The Americans, McIntyre recalled, had no concept of this art. They walked like men, not shadows. These Australians were different, every step calculated, every motion a language of invisibility. As they neared the village, McIntyre noted the first clue: a fire left smoldering, a faint scent of cooked rice, a man walking barefoot through shallow mud. The operators froze, blending with the environment. Kane tilted his head, signaling for McIntyre to watch. The villager passed within meters, unaware of the predators in plain sight. "Observe," Kane whispered. "We do not rush. We let the forest move first. Only then do we move." Hours passed like this. The men crawled through mud, clinging to roots, shifting their weight to avoid disturbing the soil. Their rucksacks, soaked in sweat, mud, and fish sauce, hung heavy, but their weight was nothing compared to the discipline each operator carried in their mind. One false sound, one misplaced movement, and the operation could be compromised. Finally, they reached the supply cache. A small hut, defended by 2 Viet Cong guards, neither expecting an intrusion. The Australians did not storm in with guns blazing. Kane observed the positions, catalogued the rotation of the guards, the angles of patrols, and even the way the moonlight cut across the bamboo floor. Every detail was memorized. Then silently, the strike began. One operator, a specialist in cold kills, approached the nearest guard from behind. His movements were fluid, animalistic, precise. The man never made a sound. His life ended in a fraction of a second. The second guard was neutralized similarly, unseen and unheard. McIntyre felt his stomach churn with awe and horror. These men had transformed patience into a weapon more effective than bullets. Kane signaled for the others to secure the intelligence, maps, logs, and communications documents. They were packed into waterproof pouches, tied carefully to the rucksacks that themselves had become extensions of the operator, concealing, protecting, and preserving both the men and the spoils of their mission. But it was not over. McIntyre knew from training that the hardest part of any raid was the extraction. The operators could vanish in daylight if necessary, but tonight, the forest demanded discipline. The Australians retraced their steps with painstaking precision, ensuring that no trace remained. Every footprint, every bent branch, every displaced leaf was restored. If the Viet Cong returned, the jungle would appear untouched, and the predators would have vanished like ghosts. Yet the true mastery of the SAS was not in stealth alone. It was in the way they weaponized perception itself. As the patrol moved through a small clearing, Kane deliberately dropped a few scraps of torn paper, a rucksack strap, slightly exposed. Moments later, distant voices, startled, whispered through the jungle. The Viet Cong, thinking they had been discovered, began to search frantically, a psychological trap laid by men who would not be seen. By the time they reached the river for extraction, the operators had moved miles through mud, water, and brush, leaving nothing but silence behind. The extraction helicopter hovered above, unaware of the ordeal the men had endured. One by one they climbed aboard, still coated in filth and reeking of the fermented jungle, their eyes glazed yet alert. McIntyre observed them, noting the physical toll. Skin raw from mud and vegetation, hands bleeding from thorns and leeches, muscles screaming from exhaustion. Yet their minds remained unbroken, tuned to a frequency that few humans could comprehend. Pain, hunger, and disease were tools, not obstacles. Their suffering had been transformed into power. Once airborne, Kane finally spoke to McIntyre, his voice low and steady. "Every inch of that forest belongs to us, when we understand it. They thought they controlled the night, but the jungle has no masters, only students." McIntyre nodded slowly, realizing the depth of what he had witnessed. These men had taken warfare beyond technology, beyond firepower. They had embraced the forest itself, allowing it to shape their senses, their bodies, and their minds. The Americans, for all their weapons and radios, could not hope to match such mastery. When the helicopter touched down back at base, the operators moved with the same silence they had maintained in the jungle. No words were exchanged, no celebrations were made. They were alive, yes, but their minds were elsewhere, cataloging, analyzing, preparing for the next mission. McIntyre followed behind, his thoughts racing. He had seen the first strike. He had seen what it meant to be part of the jungle rather than apart from it. He had seen patience, discipline, and transformation weaponized in ways no conventional army could understand. And somewhere, deep in the forest they had left behind, the enemy waited, oblivious to the predators already watching. The lesson was clear. In Vietnam, the loudest gun did not win. The sharpest eye, the quietest step, and the ability to vanish into the environment itself decided life and death. And the Australians had mastered all three. The jungle was alive in a way that made every American soldier uneasy. Captain Whitfield had seen war before, but nothing prepared him for the reality of Australian Special Air Service operations in Phui Province. They moved like shadows, silent and deliberate, blending into the canopy, their bodies and minds honed to an almost unnatural focus. The first shock came when he observed a returning American patrol. Tired, careless, they had dropped their packs, lit cigarettes, and relaxed in the clearing. To Whitfield, they seemed safe. To the jungle, they were targets. A patch of mud shifted. A bend of foliage betrayed a presence. And suddenly, an Australian operator rose from the ground as though birthed from the earth itself. Whitfield watched in disbelief. The Americans jumped back, terrified, before realizing the enemy was on their side. The transformation these men underwent was not cosmetic. Weeks in the jungle, systematic exposure to local diets, fermented fish, and the abandonment of all Western hygiene had reshaped them biologically. Their sweat, clothing, and equipment blended seamlessly with the forest. They had become invisible, not just to sight, but to smell. American Marines, clean and perfumed, carried olfactory signatures that betrayed them meters before contact. The Australians had weaponized their own bodies, turning odor and filth into camouflage, creating a psychological cloak that no conventional training could replicate. Whitfield learned quickly that their rucksacks were sacred, not simple equipment carriers. Touching one was forbidden, a violation punishable by immediate force. A friendly helicopter crew chief discovered this firsthand when he tried to help an exhausted operator lift his pack. A concealed charge exploded, maiming him instantly. The lesson was clear. The SAS had militarized every aspect of survival. Even their gear was a weapon, and their doctrine demanded ruthless discipline. Tracking, patience, and observation defined their operations. They used Aboriginal trackers to interpret the jungle in ways Americans could not. Every broken twig, displaced pebble, or startled bird carried meaning. They became predators in an ecosystem that had been a refuge for the enemy. Every mission was an exercise in invisibility, endurance, and precision, often stretching human limits. Operation Leech exemplified this. A 5-man team submerged in the swamp for 72 hours, enduring leeches, maceration, and constant immobility, to ambush a high-ranking Viet Cong officer. They waited silently, motionless in the water, until the perfect moment to strike. When it came, it was swift, silent, and absolute. No shots were fired, no alarms raised. Within seconds, the target and his guards were neutralized. The patrol emerged from the swamp with bodies racked by exposure, skin sloughing from infection, eyes hollow but focused. Yet the mission was flawless. The psychological terror of this display echoed throughout enemy ranks. If the Australians could endure that, what could stop them? Every action reinforced the broader strategy. The enemy could never feel safe, even in familiar territory. The Australians demonstrated that survival was inseparable from adaptation. Technology, firepower, and numbers mattered less than understanding and becoming one with the environment. Every inch of jungle, every branch, every shadow became an ally or an obstacle. The SAS turned it all into advantage. Whitfield observed the toll this took on the men themselves. Physically, they were battered. Psychologically, they had learned to compartmentalize pain and fear. Discipline was both shield and weapon. Sleep was scarce, comfort non-existent. And still, they moved with a predator's focus. Yet for all their prowess, they carried the weight of their transformation, a cost few could measure. Pain was proof of commitment, endurance a rite of passage. By mastering it, they became something more than soldiers, something almost otherworldly. The American patrols, oblivious to the nuances of jungle warfare, were left in awe. Equipment alone could not have achieved what these men had done. The enemy could be outmaneuvered, outthought, and rendered terrified, not through firepower, but through skill, patience, and an understanding of biology and environment that was centuries ahead of conventional doctrine. Whitfield realized that what made the SAS so effective was not just technique, but transformation. They had surrendered their own comforts, their own humanity in small doses, to become instruments of war perfectly attuned to the environment. And in that adaptation lay victory, not just over the Viet Cong, but over the limitations of traditional military thinking. Captain Whitfield returned to the American base at dawn, his mind heavy with the realities he had witnessed. The jungle seemed quieter than ever, almost reverent, as if acknowledging the presence of men who had become part of it. He had spent weeks observing the Australian SAS, shadows in the undergrowth, silent hunters, predators who smelled of decay, and moved with inhuman patience. They had not just survived the forest, they had mastered it. As he walked among American soldiers, Whitfield noticed the contrast sharply. Their uniforms were clean, their gear polished, their steps heavy with the weight of civilization. Every ounce of training, every piece of equipment was meaningless against an enemy who had become the environment itself. The Australians had transcended doctrine. They had become hunters, philosophers of war, and alchemists of survival. And in doing so, they had reshaped the battlefield entirely. He thought of the rucksacks, the sacred objects that no one could touch. Inside them were more than weapons and supplies. They were the physical embodiment of a worldview, a philosophy that demanded total commitment. One misstep, one act of curiosity, and death could follow. The Americans had been warned, yet understanding took longer than obedience. Whitfield realized that these men had weaponized every part of themselves, their bodies, their senses, even their suffering, into a singular instrument of war. The true cost of this mastery, however, was hidden from most eyes. The Australians carried scars invisible to the public. The psychological toll of hours submerged in swamp water. The long nights spent motionless in the forest. The relentless hunger. The pain embraced as a tool of survival. Many would return home haunted, their nerves irreparably tuned to the edge of combat. Civilian life offered no structure, no predator to hunt, and the adjustment was often impossible. Whitfield understood then that the price of becoming a ghost was perpetual vigilance, even after the war ended. Yet for all the suffering, there was power. The SAS had rewritten the rules of jungle warfare. Firepower and numbers mattered little when patience, discipline, and adaptation could render entire enemy units helpless. The men had become living lessons in strategy, endurance, and fear, proving that willpower, insight, and understanding of nature could surpass technology. Before leaving Vietnam, Whitfield received a small, unassuming gift from the sergeant who had first warned him about the packs. A single Australian playing card, the ace of spades. It was stained and worn, a token of respect, a message from the ghosts of the forest. They were always watching, always present, and forever unbound by the conventions of war. Whitfield would carry that lesson for the rest of his life. Technology could be duplicated, artillery could be manufactured, intelligence could be analyzed, but the willingness to become something beyond human, to surrender comfort and fear, to embrace pain as a tool, could not be replicated. It was the essence of the Australian SAS, invisible, lethal, and enduring. In the jungles of Vietnam, the Americans brought machines. The Australians brought ghosts. And in the end, it was the ghosts who defined the war. Do not touch their packs. The jungle had its hunters, and they had already won.